myself. I'm Almaz Zelleke. I am the Secretary-Treasurer of BIEN, of the Executive Committee of BIEN. And in that capacity, I'll just take a moment to remind you that tomorrow at the conclusion of the conference, we have our General Assembly meeting at 1:30 in this room, and all are welcome. There are some activities at the General Assembly that are limited to like members of BIEN, but attendance is not one of them, attendance and participation in discussion. So please come if you're interested in the doings of BIEN. And in addition, nominations for any of the positions on the Executive Committee, which like members can run for and vote for, are due to me by the end of today. Have to be in the day before the General Assembly, so you can give them to me. And also, I've had many people come up to me and ask about life membership in BIEN. There is information on the BIEN website about how to become a life member. If you need to, you can also just see me personally. But with that, let's get started, because we don't have that much time for our presentation today, and I want to make sure we give it all the time that it deserves. So today, our speaker is Joe Soss, who is a political scientist and the Coles Chair for the Study of Public Service at the University of Minnesota. Professor Soss's research and teaching focus on the interplay of democratic politics, socioeconomic inequalities, and public policy. He's particularly interested in the policies that govern social marginality and shape life conditions for socially emotional groups. He is the author of Unwanted Claims, The Politics of Participation in the U.S. Welfare System, and Disciplining the Poor, Neoliberal Policymaking and the Persistent Power of Race. Neoliberal Paternalism and the Persistent Power of Race. He's also the co-editor of Race and the Politics of Welfare Reform and Remaking America, Democracy and Public Policy in an Age of Inequality. Please join me in welcoming Professor Soss.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak on such an important topic today. And it's been wonderful to be at a conference where so much important work is being discussed. I'm looking forward to the conversation following my remarks. Taking the recent history of the United States as my case, I'd like to explore three key themes in my talk today. First, I want to suggest that efforts to democratize the economy, our conference theme, must pay equal attention to democratizing the polity. Each depends on the other because the political economy operates in an integrated way. It's no accident that the Gilded Age of the late 19th century and the new Gilded Age in America today both exhibit a powerful convergence of political and economic inequalities. The two tend to rise and fall together because they are in fact mutually constitutive. Second, I want to highlight the central role that politically created policies and institutions play in shaping the terms of this political economy. The great compression of income and wealth in the mid-20th century United States was to a significant degree a product of political movements that changed the rules of the game. The same is true of our more recent turn toward oligarchy. And third, I want to argue that particularly important lessons can be drawn from the disciplinary turn that has recently come to American poverty governance and its corrosive effects on democracy. Drawing together two streams of my research on poverty governance and on the ways policies create politics, I'd like to suggest some empirical bases for thinking about the basic income and its potential to democratize the political economy. To clarify the present, it's helpful to begin with the period that preceded it. In the first half of the 20th century, social movements and reformers aided by a depression and two world wars restructured the political economy in the United States in ways that allowed large numbers of white Americans to rise to unprecedented levels of political influence and economic security. In two great waves, progressive and New Deal movements attacked the corrupt system of plutocratic rule that dominated the Gilded Age. The reforms they created forced elites to share political power and economic gains far more broadly. Even a cursory listing, I think, of these changes suggests their enormity. Reformers created substantial taxes on the rich and a vast array of social supports and protections for Americans in the lower two-thirds of the income distribution. Workers secured rights to organize and strike, which transformed power relations throughout the political economy. Women won the right to vote, and electoral power was increased throughout the polity. Reformers dismantled systems that allowed the moneyed classes to rule through corruption, bribery, and patronage. And they created new workplace regulations, floors under wages, and restrictions on exploitative banking and finance practices. Now, economic and political elites continued to stand at the center of American governance, and the U.S. remained far from a true democracy. The U.S. government remained subject to the structural limits of a capitalist state and advanced capital accumulation in a host of ways. Women remained subordinated in law and practice, and race continued to define the scope of full citizenship, and in the South stood at the center of a deeply exploitative and violent authoritarian regime. But in ways that centered on white working men, yet were not strictly limited to them, the new policies and institutions constrained American elites and forced them to be more responsive to empowered publics. Thus, as the United States achieved a dominant position in global markets after World War II, something fairly unusual in world history happened. The fruits of economic prosperity were not simply hoarded by those at the top. From the 1940s to the 1970s, economic inequalities fell to historically modest levels in the U.S., and prospects for upward social mobility rose. Gains in economic productivity raised income levels across the income distribution, at the bottom in percentage terms as much as at the top. Growing numbers of Americans had access to middle-class lifestyles, and even among low-skilled, low-status workers, lives of reasonable security and opportunity were increasingly within reach. Now, some progressives today have a rosy nostalgia for this period that ignores its many systems of exclusion and oppression. But even as we're careful to avoid this mistake, we have to recognize that in these decades, elites governed under some significant popular and institutional constraints. Government acted in some ways as a meaningful countervailing power to market domination that facilitated a somewhat broader sharing of prosperity. Over the course of what we might call the long 1960s, a third wave of mobilization, most notably the civil rights and women's liberation movements, rose up to contest the barriers that reserved full political and economic citizenship for white working men. The achievements of these movements in dislodging hardened, overt forms of exclusion and hierarchy cannot be overstated. But just as historically marginalized groups were finally moving toward fuller incorporation, a new wave of political mobilization emerged to limit the conversion of liberation movement victories into a more just and democratic social order. Beginning in the 1970s, a powerful coalition emerged among business interests, religious conservatives, racial conservatives, and neoconservatives. These forces first overtook and transformed the Republican Party, and then divided and transformed the Democratic Party. Rhetorically, the coalition attacked big government, but the neoliberal agenda it advanced did not dismantle the activist state built over the preceding decades. Rather, it de-democratized the state, concentrating political power among contending groups of elites. It restructured the state, imposing market models on government operations and market criteria for evaluating state performance. And it redirected the state, turning its activist powers toward projects that serviced markets, advanced capital accumulation, and enforced social order. We should be careful not to read history backward and imagine that a unified group envisioned and planned and carried out the changes that transpired. The ascendant interests included diverse factions that often had to compromise and often worked at cross purposes. But through a series of investments and strategies, these groups attacked the institutional structures that had democratized, partially at least, the political economy during the preceding decades. More affirmatively, they reconstructed policies and institutions in ways that made it easier to hoard income and wealth and to convert economic resources into political influence. They invested heavily in think tanks to shift the intellectual and political discourses surrounding policy and law. They rolled back limits on campaign finance and lobbying and other political uses of wealth, and then they invested deeply in these activities. They worked to undercut labor, unions as a force of political and economic equalization. Key decision processes were moved to less visible and accountable government venues and out of government altogether through financialization and a host of of new public-private partnerships and cross-sector collaborations. Through redistricting and new voting restrictions, they reduced electoral accountability and reduced pressures as well to respond to public grievances. They moved to reinvent government in ways that privilege the efficient delivery of products to consumer citizens over processes of public participation and collective accountability. And at the same time, reformers moved to weaken the state itself as a tool that publics can use as a countervailing power. Through tax cuts, they deprived the state of revenues and administrative capacities needed to respond to new market developments. Cut to the bare minimum, regulators and other administrators have become far weaker agents of the public interest. Now, in this political landscape, policy victories accumulated to rewrite the rules of the economy in favor of those at the top. Some of the key policy changes included steeply regressive tax cuts, deregulation of industries and financial markets, privatization of government operations to create profitable new arenas of investment, a substantial erosion of labor standards, wage floors, and curtailments of labor unionization, reductions in redistributive programs, especially in those that were decommodifying it in the sense that they offered benefits outside the labor market. The economic consequences of these policy changes have been profound. After the mid-1970s, the American economy continued to grow, but now those at the top took home ever larger slices of the pie, while income stagnated for the vast majority. Inequalities of income and wealth rose skyward and social mobility declined. The richest pulled away from the rest, and it became harder for Americans of modest beginnings to work their way up to a better life. At the top, material affluence and political influence accumulated on a scale not seen since the Gilded Age. In 1983, the ratio of CEO to worker pay was 46-1 in the United States. By 2013, it was 331-1. The share of income going to the top 1% in America rose from around 9% in the 1970s to about 22% today. And since 2009, the wealthiest 1% have captured 95% of post-financial crisis growth, while the bottom 90% have actually become poorer. In the most recent 2012 presidential election, fewer than 200 of the country's 310 million households, fewer than 200 of the country's 310 million residents, that's less than 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% of Americans contributed 80% of all super PAC donations. Before the last decade or so, only avowedly radical scholars used concepts like plutocracy and oligarchy to explain US politics. Today, these terms have become commonplace in political science, as careful studies repeatedly show that policy outcomes have no statistical relationship to the preferences of most Americans, but are uniquely responsive to the very richest. And as the affluent consolidated power, members of the middle class became far less able, politically speaking, to shape the conditions of their own lives. Partly as a result, the middle class shrank and shifted toward a position of greater precarity. Risks that had been socialized through state and market institutions now shifted through policy changes onto the backs of individuals and families. Life events related to aging, disability, health episodes, family transitions, and so on were now associated with greater odds of economic calamity. As public funding for education and other paths toward social mobility dried up, families and individuals took on still greater risks, often taking out large loans to finance a roll of the dice on a better future. The root of the problem was that as the wealthiest claimed more, fewer jobs were able to provide a family with a secure middle-class lifestyle. In 1979, for example, 50% of national jobs offered at least $17 an hour, a retirement plan, and health care in 2006 dollars. Now in 2006, pre-recession, notice, only 25% did, half as many. And over 30% of the jobs offered none of the above. As wages stagnated and then declined, middle-class Americans have had to run harder and harder just to stay in place. Women taking advantage of the victories of the liberation movement entered the workforce in droves, allowing many households to cope, at least for a time, by adding a second adult earner. But the declining rewards of work meant that on average, two-income families in the late 2000s brought home 15% less than one-income families had in the 1970s. So Americans worked more hours per week. They took on crushing levels of credit card debt and borrowed as much as they could against the values of their houses. And of course, we saw how that turned out. But these and other coping strategies have been no match for changes in the basic rules of the game. More and more, middle-class Americans find that prosperity, security, and political influence are beyond their reach. Against this backdrop, we can see that the disciplinary turn in poverty governance in the last decades of the 20th century was far from an isolated event. It was part of a broader reorganization of the political economy, a turn toward a new Gilded Age that combined a winner-take-all economy with insulated, market-servicing modes of elite political rule. For poor and near-poor adults at the bottom of the social order, who remain disproportionately women and people of color, recent decades have been marked by increasingly grim job prospects and more aggressive state supervision. As manufacturing and other unionized jobs dried up after the 1970s, labor markets for low-skilled workers more or less imploded in the U.S. Growing numbers of jobs excluded applicants who lacked skills and credentials, and the earnings gap between low and high-skilled jobs expanded. Work that could still be found in the service, agriculture, and retail sectors offer poverty-level wages and low or no benefits. These jobs are marked by high turnover and very few opportunities to move up a job ladder. They impose fluctuating and unpredictable hours on workers that disrupt efforts to plan and to meet personal and family responsibilities. In other words, they're basically impossible to work for people who have a life outside of waiting to work. Over this period, many factors affected poverty rates in the U.S., but recent empirical analyses revealed two key facts. First, from 1979 to 2007, the single largest factor by far pushing poverty rates up in the U.S. was rising inequality and the hoarding of economic gains at the top. Second, with the affluent claiming more, poverty rates in these decades became sticky. That is, positive movements in the economy ceased to have positive effects on poverty rates as they had in earlier decades. Political dominance by business interests and the affluent meant little responsiveness to the growing struggles of the disadvantaged. Existing social protections were pared back, and new needs for childcare and other workplace supports went unaddressed. Public housing and policies to make market housing affordable were decimated. In 1970, there were 6.2 million poor renter households and about 6.5 million affordable rental units in the U.S., about the same. By 2009, there were 10.9 million poor rental households and only about 5.4 million rental units. To cut costs and bolster work incentives in a declining labor market, policymakers worked to restrict cash aid outside the market. State general assistance programs were slashed. Benefit levels for families with children went into free fall, dropping by more than half over 3 decades. And eventually, policy changes made even these meager benefits less available. In 1979, 82% of poor families with children received AFDC benefits. By 2010, this number had dropped to 27%. As resources became less available through jobs and social programs, the circumstances of Americans at the bottom became increasingly dire. Poverty rates rose to levels not seen since the start of the war on poverty, and the number of families living in deep poverty, less than half the poverty line, rose steadily. In 2011, more than 1.4 million American households, including 2.8 million children, were living on $2 per day per person or less. This was an increase of over 130% over the number observed just 15 years earlier. As of 2005, and this was before the recession, 20 to 25% of single mother households were estimated to be what's called disconnected. That is, they had no observable income from either earnings or from public programs. But it would be a mistake to see this shift in poverty policy as just a return to laissez-faire, a retreat of the state that left the poor to fend for themselves on the market. To the contrary, as problems proliferated among the disadvantaged, elites turned the activist state toward a more aggressive program of directive and supervisory poverty governance. Indeed, the tough new approach to poverty was no accident or mere byproduct of rising inequality. It was a strategic political agenda. programs. The stories work to advance business goals by disparaging tax and transfer systems and suggesting that bad things happen when people are shielded from the motivating effects of market pressures. They equally aligned with social conservatives' goals of promoting personal responsibility, virtuous self-discipline, work, and marriage. At the same time, these stories provided an ideal vehicle for efforts to remake electoral politics in favor of the rising movements. The race-coded themes of underclass pathology, welfare, and crime functioned as a wedge issue for peeling off disaffected white voters alienated by the Democratic Party's acquiescence to racial justice agendas in the 1960s. First, the voting base of the Democratic Party was divided, with white support in the South shifting decisively toward the Republicans, and then Democratic elites were divided, as a faction centered in the Democratic Leadership Council, and eventually led by Bill Clinton, moved the party toward adopting and adapting the opposition's policies as their own. In our book, Disciplining the Poor, Richard Fording and Sanford Schramm and I argue that the mode of poverty governance that emerged from these political developments can be best understood as a form of neoliberal paternalism. It was paternalist in the sense that it redesigned public programs to set and enforce behavioral expectations, to promote social order and individual self-discipline. In practice, this meant a turn toward directive and supervisory administration, punitive and custodial responses to non-compliant behaviors, increased investments in behavior modification and conditionality, and increased reliance on incarceration as a tool of poverty management. The shift can also be seen as neoliberal in the sense that it reorganized governance to adopt market logics, depend more on market actors, and serve the needs of labor markets and low-wage employers. The hallmark of the neoliberal turn is not program elimination. It's a combination of policy devolution, privatization to create profit-making opportunities, a narrow focus on employment as a rehabilitative goal and a citizenship ideal, and competitive performance systems that reward or penalize providers on the basis of a market-like bottom line. At the intersection of these logics, poverty governance in the U.S. became far more muscular in its normative enforcement and more dispersed, diverse, and market-centered in its organization. Instead of making the worst jobs more viable for the disadvantaged, poverty governance has been redesigned to make the disadvantaged more suitable and available for the worst jobs. Welfare and criminal justice programs function today as a single apparatus of state-led supervision designed to contain and manage the problems of the poor. The institutions of the system are strongly gendered, with women making up about 90% of the adults in the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF program, and men making up about 90% of the incarcerated population. Across the states, the TANF program also reflects complex shifts in gender norms. Work promotion for women is paired with heterosexual marriage promotion. Care work and contributions to social reproduction are devalued in favor of employment as a woman's primary civic obligation. And the old opposition that pitted motherhood and work outside the home against each other is replaced by a new logic that treats non-work as a failure of motherhood itself, a failure to support one's children and serve as a respectable role model. Perhaps more visibly, disciplinary poverty governance operates according to a profoundly racial logic. As incarceration rates rose over the past 4 decades, vast numbers of people of color, especially African Americans, were drawn into an expanding apparatus of state surveillance, custody, and control. The increase in black prison admissions from 1960 to 1997 alone was 517%. A 2006 study of New York City found that 18 to 19-year-old black men had a 92% chance of being stopped by the police at least once during the year. 92%. In the U.S. today, 68% of African American men without a high school degree are incarcerated before they turn 35. The tough new approach created by federal welfare reform in 1996 has followed an equally racialized path. After 1996, states with higher percentage of black recipients consistently adopted tougher versions of work requirements, time limits, sanctions for program violations, family caps to deter childbearing and other program rules. These policies actually made it harder for all poor Americans, all low-income Americans, to obtain the assistance that they needed. But black families have had to confront the toughest program designs with the strongest penalties. By 2001, just 5 years after the reforms, 63% of families in the least stringent state programs in the U.S. were classified as white, and only 11% as black. Of families in the toughest, most conditional program type, 63% were listed as black, and just 29% as white. And as these policies were implemented, racial disparities deepened. Blacks were far more likely than whites to get sanctioned, punished, in programs, especially when they possess stigmatized traits associated with stereotypes of the welfare queen. In both welfare and criminal justice, then, we find systems where ostensibly race-neutral policies channel racially defined groups into markedly different institutions and relations to state authority. And in both systems, we find that discretion at the front lines is deployed to focus surveillance and discipline in racially biased ways. In both as well, we find a sharp turn toward the enforcement of work first as a primary goal of poverty governance. Welfare programs have been redesigned to mimic the pressures of low-wage labor markets and to bolster these pressures with state authority. They strive to supply employers with labor on terms of their own choosing and to actively groom, subsidize, and incentivize workers for transitions into jobs. The adults who participate in welfare programs today are not positioned outside the market in any way. They're actively pressed into accepting the worst jobs at the worst wages. Systems of correctional control have moved in a similar direction. Contrary to what many believe, the attack on prison rehabilitation programs did not eliminate these programs at all. It recast them as work-centered interventions that operate alongside an expanding body of lucrative prison industries and work-enforcing prisoner reentry programs. The dire social and economic consequences of these developments have been well documented. What I want to focus on in the remainder of my time are the civic and political consequences. In addition to studying the politics of inequality and social marginality, I've spent most of the last 20 years exploring the ways that public policies affect the vitality of democracy and the meaning and practice of citizenship. In political science today, these sorts of questions are usually grouped under the label of policy feedback research. But they have deep roots in constructivist and participatory theories of democracy that emphasize the way that publics are brought into being through politics. Citizens, in this view, are produced through experiences of participation, and for good or for ill, engage the polity in ways that reflect the educative effects of their encounters with societal institutions and political relations. Drawing on my own research and others in the field, I'd like to suggest some specific ways that American policy today is corrosive to democratic citizenship, and in contrast, how a basic income, as part of a broader raft of reforms, might strengthen democracy. While some of these points will surely be familiar to some, I hope others will raise some new considerations for discussion. First, as a powerful redistributive mechanism, the basic income offers an effective policy tool for counteracting the economic inequalities that are now, to put it bluntly, overwhelming democratic possibilities in American politics. Policies paved the way for plutocracy's rise, and policies such as the basic income will be essential for its demise. There's simply no way to make democracy meaningful so long as vast numbers of citizens are deprived of the resources, and thus also of the time, needed to participate in civic and political life. Second, as policies have increased social insecurity and economic risk, they have undermined the power of ordinary people. Just as people accept inadequate jobs and terrible working conditions because they fear what will happen to them if they do not, so too do publics acquiesce to the destruction of their communities and natural environments out of a belief that their survival depends on maintaining conditions that are favorable to powerful business interests. By contrast, cross-national research shows that when policies reduce and equalize social risk and decouple benefits from the labor market, as a basic income would, they foster broader coalitions of popular support for social protections and greater support for social equity. Third, we must recognize that encounters with police and caseworkers and welfare agencies and so on are more than just administrative sidebars to democratic citizenship. They're very often the political experiences that bring concrete, practical meaning to concepts such as rights and obligations, power and authority, voice, and civic standings. It's in these sorts of encounters that citizens have an unusually direct personal relation to the state, often on the issues that matter to them most. As I have described, the disciplinary turn in poverty governance has channeled the most disadvantaged into uniquely authoritarian relations with the state, positioning them as objects of governmental surveillance, coercion, and discipline. In its unconditional guarantee of support, the basic income offers a powerful, autonomy-enhancing alternative to this sort of anti-democratic paternalism. Fourth, feedback research has clearly demonstrated that these sorts of paternalist authority relations are educative in ways that deepen civic and political marginalization. Policy experiences with intrusive surveillance and discipline diminish civic and political trust and cultivate perceptions of government as an unresponsive and threatening power to be avoided. Directive and supervisory programs teach citizens that it's best to be patient, compliant, and quiescent in relation to the state. Indeed, research shows that experiences with paternalistic welfare and criminal justice programs in the U.S. have strong, consistently negative effects on levels of political efficacy and civic and political engagement. A complementary line of research has demonstrated within the U.S. and cross-nationally that policies strengthen democracy and citizen engagement when they encourage citizens to see themselves as bearers of shared rights, as effective participants in decision-making, as agents who are supported in their efforts to direct their own lives, and as claims makers in systems marked by fair rules and ease of accessibility. Fifth and finally, feedback research strongly suggests that democracies are best served by policies, such as the basic income, that offer highly visible public benefits on a universal basis. As Suzanne Medler has shown, the growth of submerged or hidden and complex policy mechanisms has undercut public accountability, obscured benefits going to the powerful, and fueled public animosity toward the more visible recipients of means-tested benefits. At the same time, the divisive targeting of social provision today deepens the categorical inequalities associated with race and gender and class, and actually inscribes them on the polity. Rather than reducing the civic and political relevance of ascriptive hierarchies, these policies actively convert social inequalities into disparities in the ways citizens are positioned in relation to one another and in relation to the dominant institutions of the state, market, and civil society. By contrast, highly visible and universal public benefits have been shown to strengthen perceptions that government is responsive and can be effective in dealing with social problems. Policies of this sort strengthen civic solidarity and elevate the public's willingness to use government for pro-social societal goals. In sum, when scholars such as Deborah Stone state that done right, social policy strengthens democracy, they're not just expressing the hopes of social citizenship theorists. A growing body of empirical research demonstrates the validity of this claim and clarifies how paternalism, conditionality, and disciplinary governance undermine democratic citizenship. Now, throughout this conference, we've been learning many ways that a basic income can contribute to a more just and democratic economy. The point I hope to leave you with is that the basic income must be understood and pursued as well as part of a broader strategy for democratizing the polity. Democratization of the polity is an essential condition for democratization of the economy. We cannot have one without the other. And we cannot achieve either if we fail to remake our policies and institutions in democracy-enhancing ways. Now, to conclude that this sort of radical change is impossible is to imagine that our present era stands apart from all preceding history. The story I've just told is full to the brim with changes and reversals of many kinds. The question isn't whether things will change again. Of course they will. The question is how they will change and what role we will play in that change. In an age when we're led to believe that inequality is natural and inevitable, we must remind ourselves, political action matters. Public policy matters. And there's nothing unrealistic about the hope that, to echo Carol Pateman, we can build a society where people live within democratic authority structures that enhance their autonomy and where people have the standing, the opportunities, and the means to enjoy and safeguard their freedom.